So as Ben mentioned, we are Geneticure, and we're focused on introducing new standards of care for chronic disease by using pharmacogenomics or personalized medicine. So we're starting with the largest disease in the U.S. And the leading preventable cause of death worldwide. It's a big task, but it's a perfect candidate for this technology. Hypertension or high blood pressure affects 80 million in the U.S. Roughly half of those are not under control, and there's 5 million new diagnoses every year. Even patients who are taking their medications as prescribed do not have the condition under control, up to 40%. So, as you all are likely aware, untreated hypertension, as I mentioned, is the leading preventable cause of death in the world, leading risk factor for stroke, cardiovascular disease, heart attack, the list goes on, and it's very expensive. Providers are doing the best that they can with the tools that are available to them. And prior to the genomic age, this process is generally trial and error. There's a name for the trial and error and an algorithm. It's called JNC8. And that means that, generally speaking, each patient starts with a diuretic, which affects salt retention in the kidneys. Then that's titrated up to the maximum tolerable dose, and if it doesn't work, a second drug is added to the regimen, and sometimes a third drug, and so on. The second drug addresses vascular restriction. The third drug addresses elevated cardiac output. So this whole process takes about 65 weeks on average, and that's assuming that the patient has the discipline and the wherewithal to continue through the process. Every time you add one of these medications, non-adherence goes way up. And for a disease that doesn't have any symptoms, there's very little incentive for a patient to continue on to get better. So the other things we know about genetic components of hypertension are that patients respond to medications differently. So what might work for you might not work for me. 30 to 50% of patients respond generally to each class of drugs. So that first drug that's administered, 30 to 50% of patients will respond to that. Response is not uniform, and it's not always down. So sometimes when you give a patient a drug, there's a tail end of this bell curve response where that might actually cause the patient's blood pressure to go up, which is certainly not what we're interested in. Lastly, stacking these medications in the layered method has unnecessary or undesirable consequences, such as long-term diuretic use leading to diabetes, beta blocker use leading to an increase in insulin resistance, and dyslipidemia. So what our team of scientists have developed, and these are physiologists, geneticists, and cardiologists that have looked at about 1,500 peer-reviewed papers and developed a panel of genes that can predict drug response in hypertension to become the new standard of care for this disease. So we look at genes that are both common and functional in the cardiac system, the renal system, and the vasculature system. And through a simple cheek swab, our lab will extract DNA and look at SNPs within the genome and guide that clinician to the optimal starting point. So the whole goal here is to get patients under control as fast as possible so they start seeing results. Therefore, their therapy compliance goes up, and they're on as few effective medications as possible. All of this means improved outcomes and improved economics. So we anticipate or strive to increase control rates from that 50 to 60% up to around 85%. And the way we get there is through, again, increased therapy compliance by less office visits, quicker control, less missed days of work, less medications that are unnecessary, less medications that are not only ineffective but maybe counterproductive. And all of that adds up to a health economic scenario that makes a lot of sense to payers, to the tune of 20x the cost of our test. And that's inside of 3 to 5 years within a payer's window. There are different candidates, buckets of candidates for our test. A lot of times we think about new diagnoses only. So there's 5 million new diagnoses every year in the US. But really, when you look at the raw number of patients that are candidates for a test, a lot of those are going to come from the legacy uncontrolled and the legacy controlled patients. So for every patient that's taking an antihypertensive medication, roughly 2 out of 3 of them are taking at least one that's unnecessary or potentially even counterproductive. Same with legacy controlled, or uncontrolled. These are patients that have left the chain of care, and there's 40 million of those in the US, or maybe they never made it all the way through that path of trial and error. So Obviously a mammoth market, and this is for our first product. We've built the entire company, the testing method, and all of our assay design as a platform. We have 2 other large chronic disease tests in development right now. A little bit more about us and what makes us different. Personalized medicine is everywhere right now, and pharmacogenomics is a buzzword. But really, when you look at 9.99 of 10 companies out there looking at personalized medicine, they're looking at drug metabolizing enzymes. So CYP2D6, CYP2C19, how much of the drug is making its way into the bloodstream? For a disease like hypertension, where you have this integrative physiology aspect, that's essentially meaningless. You can have 10, 20-fold the amount of a drug, a beta blocker in the bloodstream, for example, but without a functional drug target, that drug will be meaningless. And so that's what makes us different from a scientific standpoint. But where we really try to differentiate ourselves is in clinical evidence. So we have our founding scientists are NIH-funded PhDs in their field, well published. We believe that the only way to get personalized medicine really into primary care at point of care you must be an actionable test that's supported by clinical evidence. So that's the path that we're going down. We completed a 100-subject study. We're actually enrolling an 800-subject prospective, randomized, controlled, and blinded trial, which will be the largest personalized medicine study of its kind with the leading health system in Minnesota. And then we're waiting for approval on a 2,000-subject retrospective as well. Our team comes from Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, University of Minnesota, and University of Arizona from the scientific side. We have business leaders from AssureX Health, which is probably the most analogous test to us, a leader in mental health personalized medicine. And we have a protected platform of products, so everything that I showed you is protected by patent. That's why I can't talk about our pipeline products just yet. And we're market ready as an LDT, or a laboratory developed test. We also have some great investors and strategic partners in Mayo Clinic, Fairview Health, again, Stanford University, and Wireframe Ventures here locally. So we're Geneticure. I would love to talk to you or answer any questions if I left myself any time about what we're up to. Yes, sir.
Can you talk about your sales process? Whom would you be selling, and what does the sales cycle look like?
Sure. So the question was about sales process, sales cycle, who we're selling to, and so on. So we kind of stratified our first customers as those that have an incentivized interest in the cost of care. So those are captive patient populations, health systems that have a payer side of their organization as well as a provider side that understand the cost of care, and also those populations that have a long lead time to recoup those adverse events that we help avoid, like stroke and heart attack. So the ROI for those events is really what, or the cost of those events is really what drives our ROI. So groups like the VA, large union groups, these are the first adopters. And then through our clinical study, we'll be seeking payer reimbursement, so that at 800 RCT, we'll take to payers with our health economics, our clinical utility, to seek our own reimbursement code. And then that opens up general health systems and so on. But our pricing, where we're targeting, is actually between $200 and $400, which is well within reach of patients as well for out-of-pocket pay. So how much would you pay to have a personalized medicine test for your hypertension that might help you avoid 3 to 4 office visits and avoid taking 2 extra pills for the rest of your life? So there's a big consumer aspect into it as well. Yes?
Do you plan to extend it to other diseases like diabetes, for instance?
Yeah, good question. So it was about the pipeline and the future products. Most definitely. So we can't talk about our future products just yet because we're working on IP filings right now, but there are other large chronic diseases. Some of them are more acute than hypertension, but the process is the same. So we look at diseases where there's an integrative physiology aspect, because for it to be protectable by patent, you need a multi-gene panel that has a treatment algorithm associated with it. So you can't protect the occurrence of a gene, right? So like Myriad Genetics, which tried to protect BRCA genes, went all the way to the Supreme Court. They said this is not protectable. But when you have a multi-gene panel with something that's not obvious, so integrative physiology and a treatment algorithm, then you become protectable. But it's also less obvious and more valuable from that same standpoint. So similar type of approach for future products. Great. Well, thanks for hearing about us. You have another one?
Follow-up, yes.
Yeah.
To what what extent your research is driven by IT versus more traditional bio research?
So it's very much IT driven. So we get raw data from our lab, essentially a CSV file of G's, A's, T's, and C's. That goes into a piece of software that we built. Our software looks at the G's, A's, T's, and C's, and there's that treatment algorithm is built into it, right? So it applies weighting based on each unique profile. And we look at 14 genes, 22 SNPs. The amount of profile permutations are pretty endless, right? So there's the algorithmic portion of it, but then there's also closing that loop. So when we deliver results to a clinician, in our research studies, we're collecting back-end data. So how quickly did they get under control? And then we're refining our algorithm that way. So I would say it's more software and IT based than it is physical specimen. Yes?
Is this paid by the patient or is this paid by insurance?
So right now there are existing CPT codes that can reimburse for our test. The success rate is somewhere 25 to 50%, but based on the cost of goods that we have into our test, 25 to 50% still makes a very, very healthy business. When we finish our prospective randomized control trial, the 800 subject study that we're recruiting right now, we will approach payers for our own CPT code based on the value that we derive from that study. So hopefully multiple times over what the existing code pays, but that is it goes well beyond what we were targeting in price point alone. So.